You're standing in a circle, shoulder to shoulder with kids you barely know, arms locked. Nobody's moving. Nobody's looking at you. There's a boy in the center. He's bleeding. He's begging for it to stop. And every time he drops, they tell him to get back up. You are not watching this. You are part of the wall keeping him in. Your arms are locked with the kids on either side of you. And if you let go, if you show any sign of breaking, you become what he is right now. So you hold. You all hold. That's not a byproduct of the system. That's the whole point. You look for an adult to stop this. There are adults in the room. They're timing the rounds. A stopwatch clicks. The next opponent steps in. This was called therapy. This is the story of Élan School and how a botched mail truck robbery, a rattlesnake in a mailbox, and a silent circle of children in the Maine woods led to the systematic erasure of a generation. To understand what Elan was, you have to understand where it came from. Because that stopwatch, the sound of a clinical, timed assault on a child, didn't start in the woods of Maine. It started in a living room in Santa Monica. This wasn't invented in Maine. It was inherited. Go back to 1958, Santa Monica, California. A man named Charles Dedrich, a man with no medical degree and no formal training, decides he's cracked the code on drug addiction. His method: destroy the ego, completely, publicly, in front of everyone who knows you. He called it the game. Here's how it worked. You sit in a circle. One person is in the center, and everyone else screams at them. Not metaphorically, actual screaming, degrading them, dismantling them, tearing apart everything they believe about themselves until they collapse. Dedrich called it therapy. The press called it revolutionary. The organization that grew around it called itself Synanon. For a while, Synanon looked like a miracle. Addicts getting clean, community forming, politicians taking notice. But here's the sinister part. The method that was supposed to free people was quietly being used to control them. By the late 1970s, Synanon wasn't a rehab program anymore. It was a cult. Members were physically abused. Dissent was punished. And Dedrich himself was eventually convicted for conspiracy to commit murder, specifically for ordering someone to put a rattlesnake in a prosecutor's mailbox. The man went to prison, but the method didn't die with his conviction. It spread. Daytop Village in New York was one of the programs that inherited the game. And in 1963, an 18-year-old named Joe Ricci walked through its doors, not by choice, but because the alternative was 7 years in prison for robbing a mail truck. Ricci didn't just go through the program, he became its product. Daytop called him one of their greatest success stories, and eventually, he decided to build something of his own. In 1970, Ricci partnered with Dr. Gerald Davidson, a child psychiatrist connected to Massachusetts General Hospital and a lecturer at Harvard, and opened Élan School on a 3-acre former hunting lodge in Poland, Maine. The Harvard connection wasn't accidental. It was armor, medical credentials at the front door. What Ricci brought from Synanon and Daytop stayed behind closed doors. The blueprint already existed. Ricci just scaled it and pointed it at children. Ricci didn't just build a school, he built a machine. And for the thousands of children sent to Poland, Maine, that machine started at 3 a.m. Most kids didn't arrive at Elan during the day, they arrived at night. You'd be pulled from your bed by strangers, large men, hired specifically for this. Hogtied, driven for hours through the dark. No explanation, no phone call. By the time you saw the Maine woods through a van window, the psychological collapse had already begun. That was the point. And then, almost immediately, someone would tell you the school was going to be fun, horseback riding, activities, a fresh start. Within hours, you couldn't speak to anyone. That was your introduction to what Elan called the rank system. Every new arrival entered at the bottom, a status called non-strength. And at non-strength, the rules were simple and suffocating. No talking to other non-strengths, no eye contact, no questions. You existed inside a crowd of kids your age, and you were completely alone inside it. Think about what that did. Solitary confinement works by removing human contact. Élan found something worse. It surrounded you with human contact and made it unreachable. You could see people, hear them. You just couldn't touch the connection. That's not an accident. That's design. To get out of non-strength, you climbed a rank system with at least 7 promotions. Each one took a minimum of 3 months. That's nearly 2 years, close to 700 days, just to reach the middle of the hierarchy, assuming you never slipped back. 90% of students never made it to graduation at all. They stayed until they turned 18 and could legally sign themselves out. Some stayed until they were 23, so thoroughly convinced that the outside world was more dangerous than the one they already knew. The rank system didn't just sort kids. It weaponized them against each other. Higher-ranked students were given supervisory roles over the ones below them. One of those roles was called the razor rabbit. This student was responsible for monitoring hygiene time, 2-minute showers, timed shaving, monitored teeth brushing. The razor rabbit wasn't just watching, they were required to be aggressive, punitive, because if someone in their charge screwed up, the razor rabbit got punished too. Here's the sinister part. You didn't need staff to enforce the rules. The students did it for them, not because they were cruel by nature, but because the system made cruelty the cost of survival. Refuse to report a peer, you become the target. Stay quiet in a punishment session, you're next. The only way to stay safe was to make someone else unsafe. That dynamic reached its most explicit form in what Elan called general meetings. The entire house would gather in a room. One student would be placed in the center, and then everyone, every other kid in that building, would scream at them. Insults, personal attacks, degradation, spitting. Sessions could last hours, and silence wasn't an option. If you didn't participate, you became the next target. This is how the system self-replicated. Every student who screamed in a general meeting became a little more invested in the hierarchy that protected them. Every student who got screamed at either broke and climbed or got sent somewhere worse. Staff didn't need to abuse directly. They had already built a machine that ran on the kids inside it. The rank system was designed to bend you, but for the ones who wouldn't bend, the ones the general meetings couldn't break, the system had one final, physical argument. This is what bounded choice actually looks like in practice. Your environment is controlled so tightly that every decision feels like your own. But every path available leads back to the same place: compliance. That was Elan's architecture: the rank, the silence, the razor rabbit, the general meeting. None of it looked like captivity from the outside. Inside, there was no other word for it. But the system had one tool it saved for the ones who still wouldn't break. Picture it again: a circle of locked arms, shoulder to shoulder, no gaps, a single student in the center with nowhere to go. Knowing what it looked like and understanding what it was are two different things. The ring wasn't a punishment of last resort, it was the system's final argument. When the general meetings hadn't broken you, when the rank system hadn't ground you down, when silence and isolation and peer humiliation hadn't been enough, the ring was what came next. Here's how it worked. The accused student, whoever had broken a rule or refused to comply or simply hadn't shown enough submission, was placed in the center of a room. The other students locked arms around them in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, no gaps. A sentry stood at the only exterior door, more sentries at the interior ones, and there was no exit. There was no crowd to appeal to. There was only the circle. Then they made you fight. Opponents came one at a time. Other students, often kids who were themselves forced to participate or face punishment for refusing. Rounds lasted about a minute. No water between them, no support. Just jeering from the crowd and another opponent stepping in. The session didn't end on a timer. It didn't end after a set number of rounds. It ended when you broke. When you stopped resisting the label they'd put on you. When you accepted, out loud, whatever the school had decided you needed to confess. That word, broke, was intentional. That was the stated goal. Not rehabilitation, not reflection, breaking. Now think about what that means for a 15-year-old who walked in saying he had a headache. Phil Williams Jr. was 15 years old on December 27, 1982. He'd been complaining about head pain for days. Staff decided he was faking it, performing weakness to get out of chores, so they put him in the ring. Phil was beaten until he stopped moving, until he collapsed into convulsions on the floor of that circle of locked arms. The official cause of death was a massive cerebral hemorrhage, brain stem compression consistent with a probable aneurysm. He never left the school alive. The school called it a medical event. They kept operating for nearly 30 more years. A cold case investigation opened in 2016 after a former student came forward with witness names. Maine State Police eventually closed it with no charges. 3 decades of institutional silence had done what the system was designed to do. There was nothing left to prosecute. But Phil wasn't the only one the ring was used on. Michael Skakel, nephew of Ethel Kennedy, was sent to Elan in the late 1970s for alcoholism. He'd been at the school for roughly 2 years when staff began demanding he confess to the murder of Martha Moxley, a 15-year-old girl killed in Greenwich, Connecticut. 2 years before his enrollment, Skakel refused, so they put him in the ring, repeatedly. According to trial testimony, he was beaten by rotating opponents and then physically spanked for somewhere between 6 and 8 hours. After all of that, after hours of sustained violence, he made statements suggesting he might have been involved. Those statements became the spine of a murder conviction in 2002. That conviction was later vacated. A confession beaten out of a teenager in a boxing ring in the Maine woods had sent a man to prison. That's what the ring manufactured. Not just compliance, not just submission. It manufactured confessions. It manufactured loyalty. And because the students themselves administered it, it manufactured complicity in everyone who watched. This was the cost of resistance at Elan, not detention, not a phone call home, not expulsion. The cost of resistance was the circle. Phil Williams never got out. But eventually, after 4 decades, the system itself started to crack. For 30 years, the walls of the Maine woods kept the screams inside. But in the early 2000s, the walls didn't matter anymore, because the survivors found a way to scream in a place the school couldn't reach: the internet. Elan survived for 40 years because it was very good at one thing: making sure the people inside it couldn't talk to the people outside it. But the internet changed that math. In the early 2000s, a former student using the name Jeff Wimbledon started posting, not to journalists, not to lawyers, to Reddit, to Facebook, to Tumblr. He wrote out what had happened to him in plain language, and then he did something tactically smart. He cross-linked every account he could find, so that when a parent typed Élan School into a search engine, the first results they saw weren't the school's brochure, they were survivor testimony. This is called Google bombing, and it worked because the school's only real defense had always been obscurity. Then came Joe Nobody. A pseudonymous survivor published a web-based graphic novel called Joe vs. Élan School, a panel-by-panel account of everything: the transport, the non-strength silence, the general meetings, the ring. The novel did something written accounts couldn't quite manage. It made the architecture of the place visible. You could see the circle. You could see the locked arms. You could see the faces of the kids who were screaming because the alternative was being screamed at. Millions of people read it. It was named one of the best comics of 2020. Rated it as the account that finally got it across. Not to a courtroom, not to a government committee, but to ordinary people who'd never heard of Poland, Maine. The school's enrollment collapsed. On April 1, 2011, Sharon Terry, Joe Ricci's widow, and the school's executive director after his death, announced Elan was closing. In a letter to the local paper, she blamed harsh and false attacks spread over Reddit and the internet, a system built entirely on silencing children, on surrounding them, isolating them, grinding them down until they couldn't form the words to describe what was happening to them, was destroyed by children who finally got to speak, not in court, online. But closure wasn't the same as healing. Tiffany Sedaris, sister of writers David and Amy Sedaris, had spent 2 years at Elan as a teenager. She died by suicide on May 24, 2013, 2 years after the school closed. Her siblings wrote and spoke publicly about what Elan had done to her, not in dramatic terms, but in plain ones. The school, they said, was a direct cause of her inability to form normal relationships with her family, with anyone. The school was gone. What it had built inside her wasn't. And Elan wasn't a singular event. It was a model. Variants of attack therapy and peer-led discipline still operate across the United States, often under softer names: character education, behavioral redirection, therapeutic community, the same architecture with a cleaner logo. The oversight failures that let Elan run for 4 decades haven't been fully corrected. Here's what those 40 years actually prove. Peer enforcement makes a system self-sustaining. You don't need a tyrant at every door if you've convinced the people inside to guard each other. Breaking someone is not the same as helping them. The ring produced confessions, compliance, and at least 1 death, but it never once produced a healthier person. And control works best when it feels like your only option. When the exit is invisible, you stop looking for it. In late 2024 and early 2025, arsonists burned several buildings on the abandoned Poland campus. 2 18-year-olds were arrested. Teenagers setting fire to the ruins of a place that had spent 40 years burning something else entirely. The courts never could finish it. They did. The locked arms were never the real prison. The circle looked like a physical thing. Bodies, shoulders, children pressed together, keeping someone inside. But the arms were just the visible part. The real lock was what happened after. When the boy finally broke, when he stopped looking for the exit, not because the exit disappeared, but because the system had convinced him it was never there. You don't need bars for that. You don't need guards. You just need someone to believe, completely, that leaving is more dangerous than staying. That the world outside is crueler than the one they already know. That the people in the circle are the only ones who understand them. Elan is gone. The campus in Poland, Maine, is a ruin, but the architecture didn't die with it. Because you don't need a boxing ring to build the same fence. You don't need a rank system, or a stopwatch, or 40 acres of Maine woods. You just need a doctrine that decides who is loyal, and a rule that cuts you off from anyone who questions it. No ring, no general meeting, just the same invisible exit, the same certainty that leaving leads somewhere worse, the same people, standing shoulder to shoulder, convinced they're free. That system is still running, right now, in broad daylight, in organizations with lawyers and lobbyists and celebrity spokespeople. Scientology calls the loyalty doctrine ethics. It calls the severance rule disconnection. If you question the group, you are declared a suppressive person, and everyone you love inside it is required to cut you off. Not encouraged. Required. The fence looks completely different. The mechanism is identical. And the people inside it, educated people, adults, people who would tell you they'd never fall for something like this. They can't see it either, because you never can, from inside. That's what's next. Awareness is the only thing that ever actually shut one of these places down. Subscribe so you know what to look for before the arms lock. And share this with someone who still thinks they'd never fall for something like this, because that certainty, that's exactly where the fence gets built.